This is a 102.7 FM Toowoomba original podcast.
Welcome everybody to my podcast, Big Little Small Talk. I'm Megan O'Hara-Sullivan and I love to talk, but I also love to listen. If you're new here, welcome. Thanks for joining me today. I hope you enjoy the episode. And we have Robert Ketton here with us.
Hello, Megan.
Thank you, Robert, for coming. I saw you give a lecture to Arts National the other night, formerly known as ADFAS. You've had a lot to do with ADFAS over the time. Can you tell me about some of the things that you've done and what does ADFAS mean?
Well, ADFAS was the Australian Design and Fine Arts Association, and basically they were talking about fine art, about painting, sculpture, that sort of thing. But I hope nobody's listening from ADFAS because the average age is about 102. And they realized that perhaps the subjects that they were talking about were just a little restrictive. And if they had broader topics, it might help to get a bigger audience because they were predominantly all ladies of a particular age and they wanted their husbands to come along. Well, I have a passion about trains. And so I talked about the literature of trains. I gave a lecture about life is like a railway, which sounds like a sort of Anglican vicar, doesn't it? And then I sort of spread my wings a bit and I do talk about great speeches of the world because I'm a great student of speeches. And I also talked about all sorts of things. Probably the most interesting one I think I've given was with my wife, and we talked about the artist J.M.W. Turner. And while I talked about his life, my wife painted a Turner-esque picture live in front of the audience. And that was great because they could see what I was talking about actually being realized on the canvas. So, that became popular. And that gave us, I think, our biggest tour of sort of more or less most of Queensland and most of New South Wales.
Right.
But I've been down to Adelaide and I'm going to Launceston next month. So, yes, Arts National has been a good thing for me. Keeps the brain going.
Keeps the grey matter not so grey.
Yeah.
I tell a story how my mother in the 80s used to go to her ADFAS meetings at the Sunshine Coast.
Yep.
And she said it was a sea of grey bobs,
Yes.
much like myself now. And we used to tease her mercilessly because we said, well, you're just off, at your snooty lectures.
Yes.
But now I go to Arts National because I love it. It is so stimulating. The topics are so varied and so valuing, again, the arts. And I think if anyone's listening who wants to have their grey matter tickled once a month, I think, from paintings to tessellated patterns of
to Oscar Wilde. They're going to talk about Oscar Wilde soon, yes.
Yeah.
Does it alarm you that you're turning into your mother?
Well, not really, no. And what I like about it is it's so genteel and
It is.
there's even cucumber sandwiches at the end of it. But tell me about how you get on the circuit. Like, so ADFAS gets speakers and then...
Well, what happened was the local branch, a Toowoomba branch, approached me and said, would I do a lecture? And I said, yes, I would. And they must have liked it because after each session, there is a report goes into the central organizing committee. After the Turner in particular, but after most of my lectures, I've had a reasonable report. So then other organizations say, oh, well, if he's all right, we'll have him on that topic. And that's how it happens.
So you kind of go into a pool, do you? And
Yes.
then each branch, like the Cairns branch or something, looks at who's available.
That's right. And that's one of the delights of doing the tours because you go from everywhere to, the Canberra branch, as you would imagine, is full of the most erudite and well-educated people and the facilities are to die for. And then you go to somewhere like Scone and there's a little church hall and, it's a delight.
Yeah.
The variation.
You said your wife, Catherine, painted
Yes.
a Turner-esque painting.
Yes.
What is a Turner? What's particularly relevant points for a Turner painting?
Yes. Well, how long have you got?
Oh, give me the brief overview.
Okay. Well, many people regard him as the forerunner of modern art. So what he was doing was transitioning from very, very constable-like art. Now, if I mention the word constable, people might think of the Haywain or very traditional landscapes, well executed. He was going a step further and sort of beginning to blur the edges almost to impressionistic style. And he became famous to blurring it to the extent that storms and seascapes became his trademark. And he really was a master of evoking the storm at sea.
What era are we talking here?
We're talking from about 1790 to about 1850 something. I can't remember exactly.
Yeah, because when I looked up Robert Ketton, as I tend to do before these interviews, I found this person who was obviously not you, but I thought it was quite cute. So Robert of Ketton, do you know about him?
I do.
Rodbertus Kettonensis,
Yes.
from 1141 to 1157, not a very long life, was an English astronomer, translator, priest, and diplomat, active in Spain. He translated several works of Arabic into Latin, including the first translation of the Quran into any Western language, which I thought was very fitting for you.
I have got a great admiration for him. And there is a little village called Ketton, and presumably Robert of Ketton lived in that village. This is interesting. My family had a farm in Lincolnshire forever, and we're all buried in the churchyard. And my father said to me, he said, "Oh, if you ever want to know about family history, go there." So I did, and that's interesting. We go right back to sort of 14 something, and we've got records and what have you. But what was fascinating was last birthday, my wife bought me Ancestry.com. And much as expected, yes, it's English. Yes, it's a bit of Scots. Yes, there's a touch of the Low Country, because a lot of people came across to Lincolnshire from places like Holland to help with the dams, and 15% Romany.
All right.
So I was tickled pink to think that somewhere along the line,
got something exciting.
I've got a gypsy.
You know what? I've never been able to understand with Ancestry.com when they say you're 15% Romany.
Yeah.
What does that mean, though?
I haven't a clue.
No, or 30% Dutch, or I just
Yeah. Well, I presume they are able to identify genetically your makeup. A good friend of mine is from a tiny island of Scotland. It's called Colonsay, actually. It's got a population of about maybe a couple of hundred, And Ancestry.com said, "Oh, you're from Colonsay."
Oh, wow.
So
isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
Well, my only experience with all of these, someone spits in a jar here and then someone spits in a jar over in Sweden.
Yes.
And it's turning up all of these children that people didn't know that they had.
Yes.
So any skeletons in your closet?
Well, obviously a gypsy. So if you want your fortune told or a horse stolen, I'm your man.
So you're obviously from Northern England,
Yes,
is that right?
that's right.
The lecture you were giving the other night was called the Pitmen Paintings, or Pitmen Paintings.
Yeah.
Can you tell the listeners what that's about?
Well,
Robert, what I will do is get you to start off the story with how you started the lecture the other night, if you wouldn't mind.
righty-ho. I went down the pit when I was about 10 years old, and my mom got us up about 5 o'clock in the morning, and I walked with our kid, my brother, across the wagon way and to the pit head, and I went down the shaft. And I was terrified. I was absolutely terrified. The dark, the noises, I hated the dark. And when I got to the bottom, they got us opening and closing the doors. You have to have doors, otherwise the wind would go round the wrong way. If you didn't have the door, the air would find the fastest way and we'd all be dead. So they had me doing that, opening the doors, closing the doors, opening the doors, closing the doors. And when I went home at night, I was that tired, I went straight to bed. And when the other kids came round to see if I was going to play out, my mum said, "No, go away. He's too tired to play out." And the next day, 5 o'clock, I'm up again, same time, down the pit, opening the doors, closing the doors, opening the doors. And they had me doing that for 4 years until they put me on the pit ponies. And I started doing that in 1897. Well, it's now 1934, and I've never missed a day, not a single day.
Beautiful. I love it. I just didn't know where you were going when you first started. I thought it was that Monty Python skit. You know, we got up 5 o'clock in the morning, licked the road clean before we went to work.
It's a bit like that,
Yeah.
isn't it?
So where is that? Is that a translate or a piece of text from somewhere? Or
It's from I've adapted it slightly, but it's from a play called Pitmen Painters, and of course it's in the Geordie dialect. Now Geordie is, if I'd really laid it on, it's almost impenetrable. It has its roots all over the place. For instance, in Scotland they call children bairns, and in northeast England they call them bairns as well. And because the northeast coast there was constantly invaded by the Vikings, phrases like going home become ganyem, and ganyem is the same as it is in the Scandinavian countries. So yes, it's also, I think it's a matter of pride amongst the people there that they have this language that is almost impenetrable to other people. And when I have taken friends across there, I've been very fortunate in being able to go back quite regularly. And we took some very good friends across, and I said, I'm going to show you Northumberland. And the lady has what I would describe as a received pronunciation. It's terribly nice, the voice she has. And she couldn't understand a word of what people said. So it's an interesting part of the world.
So who and what are the Pitmen Painters then?
Well,
and with that, can you explain the significance of the School of Arts? Because I know in this region there's a lot of School of Arts, and I didn't know, is it sort of a similar?
It is.
Because of the same movement?
Yes,
Yeah.
it is. At the beginning of the 20th century, there was a preponderance of people who wanted to have education beyond the fact that they left school when they were 12 or 13. And so you get organizations. The one in England was called the Workers' Education Association. And the one over here, when I tour around, I love to see the School of Arts, because the School of Arts became a community hub, and people went there. They had lectures, they had meetings, they had talks in the same way that they were doing that in England. What's very different, as you would have seen in the lecture, is that the schools of arts here are rather nice buildings very often. And this was a sort of very dilapidated wooden hut that these miners decided that there was more to life than sort of going to work in the dark, working in the dark, and then in the wintertime coming home in the dark. So literally they were looking for some sort of enlightenment. And at first they started with evolution, and then they decided they wanted something cultural. So they hired a lecturer from the university, and he came, his name was Robert Lyon, and he came, and after a short while, he discovered that the best thing to do was to encourage the miners themselves to, draw, paint, sculpt, whatever. The result was a movement that lasted from 1934 to the early 1980s and culminated in a large exhibition in China. So it's really very interesting that men who had had no really great education, but a desire to have more to their lives, decided that they could do it possibly through studying art, because art is a bit of it breaks down social barriers. And I tell the story in the lecture of this lady called Helen Sutherland, this rather aristocratic lady who arrives at this hut in a chauffeur-driven Rolls Royce and goes into the hut. And because she is genuinely interested in the art that they're producing, there's an instant rapport. And so, as I said in the lecture, what do you do with 12 miners? Well, you obviously invite them at home for tea, which is what she did, and they formed lifelong friendships.
Well, that whole group, the Pitmen Painters, they were just these 12 men or whatever,
Yes,
were they new people coming and
oh,
going?
yes, there were people, sadly, who there's a high accident rate. There were people who came and went, obviously. It, it started with two ladies, but they were given short shrift that women should be at home looking after the children.
Right, yes, of course they should, yeah.
Yeah.
Not doing anything as genteel as art, I
No.
suppose. So how did they improve their skills, though? Did they get people to come and coach them, or?
A lot of them, through practice, just kept doing it. There is a very believable theory that in any art form, 10,000 hours is where you start. So if you want to play the piano, act, do anything like that, put in your 10,000 hours.
This is a word of advice, kids.
Yeah.
10,000 hours. Don't be put off by it.
It's true. So that practice. But also, thanks to this lady that I mentioned, she was able to put them in touch with contemporary artists. She paid for a trip down to London for them. And so they were exposed, Manet and Van Gogh and the artists. And really, I think the greatest way to improve is to have a peer group that is honest, but not cruel. And so they had good criticism amongst themselves. And that, I think, plus the fact that they were all from the same community. The lecturer was sufficiently clever to sort of say, paint what you know, paint the local things. And so a lot of their work is about the local community, about coal mining, about the pub, about the working men's club, about pigeon racing, this sort of thing that they were all familiar with. And so it's that combination of a strong community, peer group kind criticism. Some very important critics came up and had a look. I'm talking about Anthony Blunt. Anthony Blunt was the Queen's advisor on painting. He was also a Russian spy, so it's interesting. And Guy Burgess, another Russian spy, he came up and looked, and really they became a sort of cause célèbre.
You're on Big Little Small Talk. We're talking to Robert Ketton today. Robert, you talk about the paintings that the Pitmen did, and you told the story the other night about a painter called Oliver Kilbourne, and he painted something called The Deluge. What was that painting like, and what was his reaction to it when he'd finished and saw what he'd done?
Yes, well, Robert Lyon decided that he would set topics that were very broad, but that the individual artist could interpret. And Oliver decided that he would paint the deluge. But in Oliver's words, I'd never seen a deluge. I'd seen a storm, but a deluge, I was stuck. I didn't know what to do. So I got this piece of card and I started, I just drew lines on it, really. And I wasn't thinking, I was just painting. And all of a sudden, it clicked. And I got these feelings. I was really amazed, because when I stepped back from the painting and looked outside, it was light. I'd been painting all night. And I was shaking. I was literally shaking, because for the first time in my life, I'd done something for me. It wasn't for money. It wasn't for anybody else. It wasn't for anything, really. But in those hours, I felt in control. Yes.
And you have clearly done some acting. Tell me about that.
Well, it's all luck, life. I started studying geography at Newcastle University, and that's in the northeast of England. Didn't like it. And somebody said, oh, go and do drama. So I thought, I'm going to do drama. So I did drama. And at that time, there was a woman there, a large lady, very Yorkshire, where they talk like that, And she became a world leader in educating actors and theatre, And so I just happened to be in the right place at the right time. So that when I migrated to Australia, and there was a job came up at what was the DDIAE, and they wanted somebody to teach theatre. And so I went along and had an interview with a man called Robert Gist, who was fascinating because he was an American. He had huge cowboy boots on, and they had gold rearing horses on the car. And He had his feet on the desk and he said, "Come on in, boy, come on in." And so I went on in and I got the job, along with a lot of very good other people. We developed a theatre department out there, which was called the Nida of the North. And I had a ball for many, many years until, unfortunately, the bean counters got hold of us. And we were graduating about 12 students a year, maybe 11. And we, at one stage, we had a full-time and part-time staff of something up to 15, 16 people. Economically, that doesn't make sense. But from a point of view of community theatre, we would fill that theatre every night out at the university. People would come and watch the plays and enjoy the plays. And there are many people in Toowoomba now who say, "Oh, I wish we still had it," because they were student actors. But, I mean, do you watch Bluey?
No, I'm out of the Bluey era. Yeah,
Out of the Bluey era. Well, Mum on Bluey is one of my ex-students. I've had award winners. I've had people. I don't like to name them because they've done it on their own. It's not because of me. I hope I helped them along the way, but it's their hard work and efforts that got them to where they are.
Well, listeners will remember last week we had Daniel Erbacher, who is an actor and a dancer here from Toowoomba, and he said completely unprompted that the theatre program out at USQ now, previously, and NIDA were the two preeminent theatre companies in Australia, or schools in Australia.
I think they were.
And what sort of era was that, Robert?
It went from about, 1978 to about 2000, a bit more than 2000, but the writing was on the wall sort of economically. Yeah.
And also those days were when unis had the uni club and they had bands playing there and they had, a life at university, wasn't it?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, yes. It's, it's just a different world. So much of it now is online. It's so much cheaper to do it online. And I mean, the fact is, kids these days, I'm talking about students, have to have a job. And many of them are working quite hard part-time jobs and just have time to go out maybe a couple of hours a week for face-to-face lectures. And the rest of the time, it's textbooks and online.
Is there still an art department or a theatre department at USQ?
Yes, there is, but it's pretty low-key. Yeah.
So I wouldn't imagine that you would have been in the era where the students are sitting there texting each other or not taking any notice of you then. Is that right?
Oh, sometimes. What used to happen was, for instance, the education faculty used to ask me, would I talk to the students about how you can use drama with children to stimulate their creativity and make them more confident and that sort of thing. And so occasionally I would be giving maths lectures to, maybe 200 students. And on those occasions,
they might have been.
They may have been less than excited by the prospect.
I thought, it might have been that they were actually writing to each other in those days. I thought,
they were
passing notes rather than texting.
Yeah, they were passing notes to each other.
So you were doing that hang on, can I just ask, when you left England, you graduated with a degree in theatre or something, did you? Had you ever taught over there?
Yes.
Right.
Interestingly, it sent me a list of questions, and it said, have you ever made any bad decisions, I think, at one stage? Well, I did. I made an atrocious decision, which ended up very well, because the first school I taught at was an old-fashioned boys' grammar school. And the students that were much more intelligent than I was, they'd gone through a hell of a process to get into the place. And I always remember my first lesson with the sixth form, which was the top tier. And I walked in and said, now, boys, I'm going to talk to you about theatre. I said, these islands have produced, probably the greatest theatre exponent ever in William Shakespeare. I said, we haven't necessarily produced a great musician. We haven't necessarily produced a novelist in terms of, Dostoevsky. We haven't necessarily, and I went on like this, and this boy in the front row put up his hand. And he said, excuse me, sir, but what do you think about production of philosophy? I'm thinking of the Scottish school. And he named about 10 people I'd never heard of.
And so you threw the duster at him.
No, throw the duster at him. I said, right, push back the chairs. We're going to do some practical drama. And of course, because they were all such eggheads, they both loved it and were very good at it. Yeah.
So what prompted the decision to come out to Australia? Was that
well,
going to be
no,
a permanent thing?
well, no, that was my great mistake, because at that school, it was a wonderful experience. And I was there for 2 years. And then, being young and ambitious, you have to be promoted, don't you? So I applied to another school to be a head of department. I became a head of department at the most awful school you could possibly imagine.
Was it awful? It's a
Because
different type of kid?
absolutely different type of
Yeah.
kid. But, the school that I was going to was a comprehensive school, they called it. And they were just introducing these comprehensive schools. It was in a very rough area, in a very rough town. So, you sort of went to the classroom and threw in raw meat. Well, it was not a happy experience. And at the nice school, there was a flat attached to the school, and my wife and I had just married, and we had a nice sort of Victorian terrace to live in. And when we went to the second place, there was a high rise, which was just awful.
It won't do. It would not.
It would not do. It really would not do. So anyway, I'm sort of one Sunday morning, there's an advertisement in the newspaper, and it says, "Come to sunny Queensland. We're looking for teachers." And so I said to Catherine, "There's got to be something better than this." And she said, "Oh yeah, let's give it a go." So we gave it a go, and it was a lovely interview that I had down at Queensland. Has its own house in London. You know that?
No.
Queensland House is
Yeah.
a lovely building.
Yeah.
And we went in, and it was the middle of summer, and it was quite warm. And the guy that interviewed me had a 3-piece suit and a cardigan on. So I thought, Queensland must be hot. And anyway, we got the job, and we came out to Queensland ostensibly to introduce theatre into secondary schools, because nobody was doing it then. That's not quite true. There were one or two sort of brave individuals. But my first job was to go to Warwick. And I chose Warwick because I knew Warwick wasn't too hot for Catherine, because she was a redhead. And we were regarded with grave suspicion as a man teaching theatre. Must be a bit odd.
Luckily you were married, because
Yeah.
you would have been straight in the gay basket.
Yes, I would have been straight in the gay basket. I think I was a bit in the gay basket anyway. But anyway, it's all a continuum, yes. So, well, there are two things that happened, which is very funny. The first was the headmaster said, "You teach drama?" I said, "Yes." And he said, "Well, that's noisy, isn't it?" I said, "Well, it can be." He said, "Well, there's a pepperina tree out there. You can teach under that." Well, we had arrived in sort of July in Warwick, and it's quite cold. And I realized quite quickly this is not good. So anyway, this senior student came bounding down at lunchtime to me and said, "Do you really teach theatre? I've always wanted to do theatre." I said, "Well, I do, but I said I haven't got a room." And she said, "Don't worry. My mum runs the Criterion pub in town, and we've got a supper room, and we never use it, and we can teach there." So I went and had a look at this thing. It was absolutely ideal. Beautiful wooden floor, great big room, no furniture. Wonderful.
Okay, boys, we're going down the pub.
Yes. So, well, boys and girls
Okay.
at Warwick State High School. And so I walked them down Palmer Street and into the pub, through the bar, upstairs to the supper room. When I got back to school, the principal wants to see you. And he said, "What do you think you're doing, taking children to the pub?" I said, "Well, I haven't got a room. They've got a room." It was really rather good. I had a room within minutes.
Right. So what was the bad decision?
The bad decision was to move from that good school
Oh, I see.
to the rotten school.
Right. But
And
then the good decision was that you came out here.
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Thanks for tuning in today to Big Little Small Talk. We're talking to Robert Ketton. Now, what would I be referring to, Robert, when I say it's a boy's dream, isn't it? And you're a professional liar. Tell me about Loco 106.
You've done your research. Well, in 1999, maybe 2000. I think it was 1999. There was a meeting convened at Toowoomba Town Hall to set up something called downsteam, because a locomotive 106, which was actually built at the foundry here in Toowoomba, had become available. It was rotting down at Ipswich, and a fellow called John Peel and a lady called Ros Scotney had got together, and it was possible for that engine to come up here. So they said, Robert, would you say something about, that this could be the beginning of something big? So I stood up and said that heritage railways were a wonderful thing. They helped small communities. They became an economic driver for the area because everybody loves school, steam trains. And I went on and on. And I said, we will be running trains in 5 years. We'll have Harry Potter expresses. We'll have music trains. And I waxed lyrical about what had happened. And I continued to wax lyrical and really tell fibs about what was going to happen until, what is it now? It's 223, when we actually had restored that engine. And now, of course, they run train trips. And it was always every little boy's dream when I was growing up to be a train driver, a steam train driver. I don't think diesels have quite the same cachet.
Why did you love trains so much, do you think? Did you live near the railway line, or it was just something you read in books? Or?
No, I can tell you exactly why I love trains. Have you got grandchildren?
No, not yet, question? Unfortunately.
Right.
Anytime now, boys.
Right. Well, my advice is always to people to die when their grandchildren are 12, because my granddad died when I was 12, and I never saw him with sort of the jaundiced eye of the adolescent. He was always perfect as far as I was concerned. And they were well off, put it that way. And he would say to my grandma, I'm just taking the boys to see the train. And we climb into this great big Humber motor car he had, and we'd drive off, and we'd scramble up the bank, no sort of occupational health and safety in those days, and we'd stand right next to the track, and he'd pull out this great gold watch, and he'd say, she'll be here in 3 minutes. And suddenly there was this marvelous, hissing, living thing that was coming rumbling towards us, and these wonderful maroon coaches, and you sort of looked up and you could wave at the people, and if you were very lucky, they would wave back. And I was hooked. So I spent many, many hours on the end of railway platforms taking the numbers of trains. And then when I was about 13, 14, I discovered girls, and the trains took a back seat for a long time. But then in these sort of years of declining virility, I've gone back to the trains.
You started up the train spotting again. I get it. Okay. So there's lots of TV shows about trains and things. Do you watch them, and B, do you take the trains yourself? Apart from the downsteam stuff, do you go on those big, across the desert and all of that?
Yeah. In fact, our last trip to Europe, we flew from London to Budapest, and then got the train back to Amsterdam, calling at all nice places on the way, and going through Switzerland on the train, and going through all sorts of wonderful places on the train. And whenever we go to Europe, we travel by train.
Right.
I've done
on the sleepers and things. You sleep in there as well.
I have done those, yes. I've done a little bit in Southeast Asia, not as much as I would like. And I haven't done the Rocky Mountaineer in Canada, but I would like to.
What about those ones in Bangladesh where there's just people hanging off the ceiling, off the sides, off the...
Yes. I travel with Catherine, my wife, and she's quite assertive about where we go. I don't think she'd like to go to anywhere where you sort of see those incredible scenes of people sitting on top of the train.
Yeah. Tell me some more about downsteam. You have volunteers there mostly, and you also... I think on some of those trips, like say down to Clifton, out to Pittsworth, you dress up, don't you?
Oh, well, they have carriage attendants, yes, who are, and they do have evenings where they dress up, and there's a theme and that sort of thing. But, we had a number of people early on. There was a fellow called Peter Eldridge who was tremendous at getting it going. We had a fellow called John Peel, we've had Ross Scotney, we've had Jeff Smith, we've had a lot of people who have put a lot of time into it. But until, must be 6-7 years ago now, we didn't really have an expert on steam engines. We had people who had skills, boilermakers and electricians and things like that, but nobody had actually put a big steam engine together. And then a fellow came called Andrew Caldwell, and he was a helicopter pilot out at Oakey. And his passion is steam engines. And he has restored that locomotive 106. He hasn't done all the work himself, obviously. A lot of other people have done work, but he has had the vision in his head to put it all together. And he has given Downsteam a reputation for engineering skills. And so when recently, sadly, a man died in Rockhampton who had a steam engine, that came down, and we've now got 2 steam engines, a BB-18.25, which is a magnificent beast. And also, people like Clive Burkhofer have helped us enormously. And, it's now a going concern. And I must confess, I've stepped back a bit because I want to see it succeed on its merits as a business. And I think it will.
Who was responsible for getting the inside of the carriage painted with the Dreamtime paintings? Can you remember?
Yes, I can. I'm going to call him Dommy. And when we were sort of doing heavy work, by that I mean building sheds and laying track and all that sort of thing, the average age out there is,
They're the husbands of the adverse people.
Mature, let's say. And so we needed young grunt. And so we got hold of prisoners from Westbrook. And one of the prisoners was an Aboriginal man called Dommy, a Kalkadoon man from up near Mount Isa. And we learned, was a painter. And we went out and had a look at some of his work, and it was terrific. And he said he would love to paint a railway carriage. And so we have this incredible railway carriage out there, which is a day in the Dreamtime.
Yeah.
And you enter, and if you look at what's on the right-hand side, it's the interior of Australia. And if you look on the left-hand side, it's the coast of Australia. And if you look right at the end, it's darkness, and you start at dawn behind you. So it's a day in the Dreamtime. And it's a spiritual experience.
Yeah, beautiful.
Also.
I just realised as I asked that question about us starting by you talking about the painters, we're back to painting again. We're sort of starting to run out of time a little bit, but I did want to ask you, given our guest last week was Daniel Urbacher, who again, as I said, was an actor and had been in Rocky Horror, a stage production of Rocky Horror. And so have you? Have you not?
I have, yes. I played.
In 1979?
Yes, played Eddie.
Tell me about that.
Well,
were you wearing a pair of gold togs, budgie smugglers like he was?
No. I was sort of exhumed from a fridge, basically. I think I was dead. And I sang very much a rock and roll number. But what was interesting about that was Miller, who was the big entrepreneur in theatre in those days, he gave us permission. We were the first place to have a absolutely professional production of the Rocky Horror Show. So for our reputation, he said, you're a good school, you can have the rights to it. And so we put on Rocky Horror Show. And
so was that at DDIA?
Yeah, they came out of the woodwork to see it. It was full every night, and we extended the season. And it was quite a turning point, I think, for Toowoomba, because at that stage, I got into trouble for putting on modern plays, because of language in it. And, but if you're training actors, you've got to give them contemporary theatre as well as the classics. And so when I put on Once a Catholic, which is a play about a girls' school where they play up, and it's not anti-Catholic.
Starring one Megan O'Hara.
It's not anti-Catholic, but it is about naughty schoolgirls, basically. I was called in by the then Bishop of Toowoomba, who shall be nameless, and told that we didn't want this sort of thing in this town. To his great credit, Lindsay Barker, who was the principal of DDIE at that time, said, "You can go ahead with it, Robert."
Right.
So that was that. And then I did a thing called Marisade, which was a wonderful play and was new and straight from Stratford-on-Avon. And I was called the Antichrist. Putting that. So, yeah, it's been an interesting ride.
Actually, sorry to keep going on about Daniel Airbacker, but he told the story that the person who wrote the Rocky Horror had written or been in Jesus Christ Superstar, and that's kind of that everything about Jesus Christ Superstar was the opposite in Rocky Horror, and he was kind of like this Jesus-type figure, but the antithesis of. So,
do you want my Jesus Christ Superstar story?
Yes, of course. Yeah. Were you doing that too?
No, no.
A bit more hair then?
Yes, a lot more hair. But my uncle lived next door to Tim Rice, the guy who wrote it. And he was in his very early 20s. And Andrew Lloyd Webber, of whom I'm sure everybody's heard, also lived on the other side. Uncle was sort of sandwiched by these two young creatives. And they put on what was later to become Jesus Christ Superstar, but they put it on at the local school, and they got school kids to do it, and they were learning, they were writing the script. And my uncle, who was reasonably well off, they came to my uncle and said, "Look, we're going to develop this, and we're going to call it Jesus Christ Superstar. And if you would put in £100, you could own a quarter of it." And Uncle, being very wise, said, "Oh, well, thank you, boys, but I think I'll miss this opportunity."
Oh, right. So that question that I was going to ask you, what's the biggest regret of your life? That might be your uncle's biggest regret, eh?
Certainly.
Oh, my goodness. Now, we're at the end of our time, unfortunately, Robert. I always ask two questions at the end of my interviews, and one is, do you have a favourite royal? Now, you are a fully fledged English person. Where do you stand on the royals?
I do have a favourite royal. Queen Elizabeth II has been the soundtrack of my life. I mean, I remember as a 5-year-old going to the top of our street with a Union Jack and waving and seeing the Queen. And she was a constant for a long time. And
what age would she have been then?
Oh, she'd just been coronated, so she would have been 25 or something.
Yeah, right.
And quite beautiful.
Yes.
And so she also has behaved all her life, I think, with such grace and dignity, really, and such a sense of duty, amazing. So she would be my choice as my favourite royal.
Talk about scrolling through your phone. I saw a thing on Instagram the other day that has got a picture of her every year since she was a baby up until the year she died. And it's just so fascinating to see, when does someone really start to age, and what was that like? Yeah, it wouldn't be so bad if you could have all those beautiful hats and pearls and things. Yeah. What about dancing? You a dancing man? Is there a song that can't get you off the dance floor?
I looked at that question and thought, yes, until I got my hip done.
Oh, God. Ailments. No ailments. I ban ailments on the show.
Right, okay. I could shake a reasonable leg. And I think the number that would get me on the floor was Staying Alive by the Bee Gees. So I would jig around to that. But in the Rocky Horror Show, we had to do a fair amount of dancing and things. So I've always I've never been a good dancer, but I've always enjoyed movement. Yeah.
Who is a good dancer, though? Oh. Good dancing is enjoying yourself on the dance floor, isn't it? Surely.
Yes, but, we have dancers in the family, real dancers. Yeah.
Well, we're allowed to be off on the side, sort of just, shaking a little bit.
Yeah. Yes, that's right.
Robert, it's just been lovely to hear your story, and I somehow or other I feel like I've probably only really just scratched the surface. But thank you for your stories and for your theatrics and a little bit of history. It's been lovely having you on Big Little Small Talk.
I've enjoyed it.
Yeah,
thank you.
That's it for this week. Thanks for joining me on Big Little Small Talk. I hope you can make the time to join me next week. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe on your favourite podcast app.
You've been listening to a 102.7 FM Toowoomba original podcast. For more podcasts or to listen to live and local Toowoomba radio, please visit 1027.com.au or download the Community Radio Plus app.